The wind over Dakota Ridge didn't scream. It whispered, like a tired woman talking to herself. And down below that ridge, in the wide gray stretch between two dying cottonwoods, sat a rough-walled trading post, leaning slightly, as if it had grown tired of being upright. Inside, a woman stood barefoot on the plank floor. Her eyes were steady, her chin was high. But there was a tag tied to her wrist. Another was tied to the shirt collar of the young boy standing behind her, his small hand clutching the back of her worn dress. He was trying to hide, but there was nowhere left to hide. "Lot 17, barked the auctioneer, his voice slick with cheap whiskey. "One woman, mid-40s to 50, capable of washing, baking, caring, quiet. Comes with child, strong arms, mild temper." The crowd, mostly men with creased faces and cold hands, muttered amongst themselves. They studied her like livestock. A few of them laughed under their breath, a cruel, scraping sound. No one looked her in the eyes, except for one man. He stood in the deepest shadows of the barn door, tall and motionless, like he was carved from stone and regret. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and snowmelt dripped from the wide brim of his hat. But his eyes didn't move. Not from her, not even for a second. His name was Elijah Kane. And he hadn't seen that woman, Rosalie Boone, in nearly 7 years. Not since the day he rode out, promising to return before the first snow. 7 winters had passed since then, 7 winters of silence, and the boy standing behind her, peeking out from behind the folds of her skirt. That boy had his eyes, the same dark, steady gaze. Elijah felt the air leave his lungs, punched out by a ghost. His son, a son who had never known his father. The crowd didn't notice him at first. He was just another shadow in a room full of them. Not until the bid board creaked and someone in the back called out, a dismissive voice. $2 for the both of 'em." A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the post. $2, the price of a broken saddle. Then Elijah stepped forward. Slow, controlled, as if every step he took cracked the ice of a long frozen lake inside his chest. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the sound made the laughter die in their throats. Every eye in the room turned to him. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was quiet, but it rolled through the trading post like distant thunder. It wasn't a bid. It was a statement. The auctioneer squinted, annoyed at the interruption. "We're starting at $2, friend. Do I hear 3? Elijah didn't even look at him. His eyes were still locked on Rosalie. "She's not for sale." Gasps, a dead ringing silence. The auctioneer blinked, his mouth hanging open, completely confused. A few men shifted on their feet, their hands moving closer to their belts. This was not how things were done. This was a challenge. Elijah's hand reached out, not to bid, but to act. He moved past the auctioneer as if the man were a ghost, his hand going to the boy's shoulder first. A gentle, firm touch. Then his fingers brushed the price tag tied to Rosalie's wrist. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She just whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost in the wind howling outside. "You came too late." He leaned in, his own voice a rough, broken thing. "I came as soon as I knew." With a flick of his wrist, he tore the tag from her skin. It fluttered to the dirty floorboards, a small white flag of surrender. Or maybe the beginning of a war. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. But now that he was here, would she even let herself be seen? The horse creaked under the weight of 3. The trail up the ridge was narrow, a muddy scar carved into the mountainside, slick with snowmelt. Elijah said nothing. Rosalie said less. Her silence was a wall he didn't know how to climb. Only the boy, Silas, looked back once, his small face pale as he watched the trading post fade into the gray twilight behind them. He didn't look like a boy being rescued. He looked like a boy being taken. By the time they reached Elijah's cabin, dusk had folded itself over the mountains like a soft, bruised purple blanket. The cabin was small, hewn from rough pine, the kind of place a man builds when he expects to live alone forever. The roof was patched with tar paper and stubborn care. A narrow chimney coughed a thin ribbon of smoke into the cold air. There was no welcome mat, no warm fire waiting in the hearth. But it was clean, it was quiet, and now it was theirs. Elijah held the door open without a word. Rosalie stepped through, carrying the silence with her like a heavy shawl. She held Silas's hand, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. "Place is not much," Elijah muttered, setting her small burlap sack down gently by the cold hearth. "But it's honest." She gave a small, stiff nod that wasn't quite agreement, and wasn't quite refusal either. It was just acknowledgement, like acknowledging a rock in her path. Inside, the boy found a low stool by the empty fireplace and sat, cradling his hands in his lap, his eyes darting around the one-room space. Rosalie's fingers moved to undo her shawl, but her eyes wandered, searching for something that wasn't in the room. A clock that no longer ticked, a ghost that wouldn't speak, a life that wasn't hers. It was Elijah who finally broke the stillness. He couldn't stand it another second. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Not till last month. I came back, saw your name on a list." She finally turned to face him, her eyes unreadable. "A list?" "A list of women sold," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Unclaimed, forgotten. Your name was there, Rosalie, under a man named Oren Mallory." The name felt like a curse. Rosalie didn't weep. She had run out of tears 3 winters ago, huddled in a root cellar that leaked through every storm. She had learned that tears were a currency, and she was bankrupt. "You were the only one who ever looked me in the eye," she said at last, her voice like a hymn sung for someone who'd already passed on. "But then, you left." "I didn't leave you," he said, taking a step closer. "I left the war. I left all that dying." Her eyes rose to meet his, and for the first time there was a spark of fire in their depths, a cold, hard fire. "But I died anyway, Elijah. Just slower." The wind outside picked up, pressing against the cabin walls like a memory trying to get in. But the man didn't retreat from her pain. He couldn't. He had caused it. He stepped even closer, the space between them crackling with 7 years of unspoken words. "And now?" he asked, his voice raw. Rosalie folded her hands in front of her, but he could see a tremble in them she couldn't quiet. A lifetime of holding on, and now she didn't know what to do with empty hands. "Now," she whispered, looking at the bare walls, the empty cot, the cold hearth. "Now I don't know how to be anything but forgotten." He didn't argue. He didn't make promises. Instead, he reached across the small worn table, his calloused, scarred hand covering hers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. "You're not forgotten," he said, his voice as steady as the mountain they stood on. "You're home." But as he looked into her guarded eyes, he couldn't tell if she believed him, or if she even remembered what home was supposed to feel like. His hand had reached across the past, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that her heart might never allow itself to be held again. For weeks the mountains held their breath, and so did the 3 people in that cabin. Rosalie moved through Elijah's home like smoke, present, lingering, but never, ever settling. She rose before the sun, her movements quiet and efficient. She baked bread with the same gentle, methodical patience she once gave to her bruises. She brushed Silas's hair with fingers that had once braided ribbons for a little girl she had lost too young, a daughter Elijah never even knew existed. But she did not speak more than was needed. She did not ask for warmth or for comfort. She gave, but she did not receive. It was as if she had built a fortress around her heart, and the walls were a mile high. Elijah noticed everything. He watched her from the fields as he mended fences, his hands busy but his mind on her. He saw how she stood a little too long staring at the clothesline, the wind whipping a sheet around her, as if she was thinking of just letting it carry her away. He saw how she hesitated when setting a plate for herself at supper, as if she was still unsure if she was allowed to sit at the table. He saw how her shoulders never quite let down, not even when Silas managed to make her laugh. A soft, rare sound like a summer breeze through pine needles. There were nights she stood out on the porch alone, arms wrapped tight around her own waist, staring up at the cold, distant stars. Elijah would join her sometimes. They'd stand there in the biting cold, side by side, watching the constellations wheel across the sky. They would say nothing, but in the silence a kind of sad music played, a melody both of them had long forgotten how to sing. One evening, the boy, Silas, crawled into Elijah's lap without asking. He'd taken to shadowing the man, his initial fear slowly being replaced by a child's relentless curiosity. He asked about traps and horses, and how to hold a knife so you could whittle wood but not hurt with it. "He watches you like you're a mountain," Rosalie said quietly that night after the boy had fallen asleep by the fire. "Something strong, something that won't move, no matter what storm comes." Elijah didn't smile, but his eyes softened as he looked down at the boy's dark hair, so much like his own. "And what does he see in you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Rosalie looked away, her gaze finding the darkest corner of the cabin. Something the wind already broke. And there it was, the ache, the raw, bleeding wound she carried inside her. The belief that kindness was temporary, that love always had conditions, that no one, not even a good man, could ever truly want a woman who had been sold and used and returned like faulty goods. She saw herself as a shattered thing. Later that week, while mending one of Elijah's shirts by the firelight, she pricked her finger with the needle. A single, perfect dot of blood bloomed on the white linen. She just stared at it, her needle frozen in mid-air. She stared at it for a long, long time, because that's how it always was, wasn't it? Even the softest, cleanest things carried the memory of pain. She gave all of herself to this new life, to the boy, to the cabin, even to him. But she saved nothing, absolutely nothing, for her own heart. He had brought her home, but he was beginning to realize that wasn't enough. He had to teach her she was worth keeping. But as he watched her stare at that single drop of blood, a terrible thought struck him. What if she wasn't the only one in this cabin with secrets? What if the mountain he was pretending to be was just a hollow shell, ready to crumble at the slightest touch? The thaw came earlier than expected that year. By March, the river cracked open its icy shell with a sound like a gunshot, and birds returned to the bare trees like old friends coming home. But the greatest shift, the real thaw, happened not outside in the wilderness, but inside the four walls of that small cabin. It started with Rosalie. It began small, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking. One morning, Elijah was pulling on his boots by the door when he heard her humming. Just a low, simple tune from a place too old to name, humming as she brushed Silas's hair by the window. He froze, his hand on the door latch, not wanting to break the spell. That sound, her voice relaxed, unguarded, unafraid, was the first real music his cabin had heard in 7 long years. It was more beautiful than any bird song. Later that week, he came in early from checking his trap lines to find the curtains down. Not just down, but washed, bleached by the sun, and flapping gently in the breeze like prayer flags. A thick stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with the scent of home. And pinned to the rough wooden wall was a child's drawing. 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman, and a small boy, standing under a crooked, smiling sun. Silas had drawn them holding hands. She had made a home, without being asked, without being told. She had quietly, stubbornly, breathed life back into the empty spaces of his world. But still there were shadows. He could see them in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. That night, while she was patching one of his worn flannel shirts, she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper, "What would you do if they came back?" Elijah didn't pretend not to understand. He stopped sharpening his knife and looked at her. "The man who put the price tags on you and Silas," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, her eyes fixed on her needlework. Elijah thought for a moment, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his grim face. "I'd ask him," he said, his voice low and cold as a river stone, "if he wanted to leave with all his teeth." And then it happened. She laughed, a real laugh. It was quick, almost embarrassed, like she was startled by the sound herself. But it filled the small room like spring rain after a long, hard frost. It was the sound of something breaking free, but the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. "People don't understand," she said, her voice dropping again, "what it is to be bought, and even less what it is to be returned." "You weren't returned," Elijah said, his voice as steady as a rockfall. "You were rescued." That night, for the first time, he didn't sleep in the cold barn. He didn't even sleep on the floor by the fire. He sat in the chair by the hearth while Silas slept soundly, curled near the warm coals. Rosalie stitched until her fingers ached. Then she rested in the chair beside him. Neither of them spoke. They just sat there in the quiet dark, the only sound the popping of the fire and the wind outside. And slowly, finally, they were both daring to stay. Because liberation, he was learning, didn't always come in grand gestures and declarations of war. Sometimes it was the quiet, unspoken knowledge that washed over you in the middle of the night. "I'm safe. I'm seen. I'm not leaving." She'd been sold like a thing, discarded like an unwanted parcel. But now, sitting beside this quiet, steady man, could she finally believe she was home? And could he protect that home from the man who had torn their lives apart once before? He had a feeling, a cold dread in the pit of his stomach, that he was about to find out. The knock came just before sundown, a week later. It wasn't loud, just a sharp, insistent rap on the thick wooden door. Just enough to hush the crickets outside, just enough to freeze the spoon in Rosalie's hand halfway to her mouth. Silas looked up from the book he was reading, his eyes wide. Elijah rose slowly from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. His jaw tightened. No one ever came this far up the mountain. Not friends, not neighbors. You only came this far up if you were lost, or if you were hunting something you desperately wanted back. He reached for the rifle he kept propped by the door. His movements were calm, measured, but Rosalie saw the muscles in his back bunch up under his shirt. The door creaked open, and standing there, framed by the dying light, was Orrin Mallory. He hadn't aged well. The lines on his face were sharper, crueler. His fine wool coat was too clean for the mud caked on his boots. His boots shone like they didn't belong to the land at all. But the look in his eyes, that was the same. A look of ownership dressed up as charm. A look that had haunted Rosalie's nightmares for 3 years. "I see you made yourself comfortable," Mallory said, his eyes sliding past Elijah, dismissing him and fixing on Rosalie. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. She stood tall, the stew spoon still clutched in her hand like a weapon. "You need something?" Elijah asked, his voice flat and dangerous. He was already stepping between them, a solid wall of muscle and bone. "I came for what's mine," Orrin said plainly, his smile never wavering. "She ran. She took the boy. That's theft, where I come from. Property is property." "She's not yours," Elijah said, his voice like slow thunder rolling down the mountain. Oren laughed, a short, ugly bark. The law says otherwise. Got the paperwork right here in my saddlebag. A bill of sale, signed and sealed. She belongs to me. Rosalie spoke then, her voice soft, but steady as steel. You sold us, Oren, like livestock. You were fed, weren't you? He snapped, his charming mask finally slipping. Housed. What more did a woman like you expect? Elijah took one deliberate step closer. He was a good 6 inches taller than Mallory, and a whole lot wider. Say another word like that, he growled, and I'll bury your tongue under the snow, and no one will find it till spring. Silas was on his feet now, silent, his small face pale, but his eyes were fixed on the confrontation. He was watching, learning. Oren's hand twitched, moving instinctively towards the pistol holstered at his belt. But Elijah was faster. The rifle was up, the stock pressed firm against his shoulder, his finger calm on the trigger. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed in the small cabin. Go back down that mountain, Oren, Elijah said, his voice deadly quiet. And don't you ever come back. Oren's eyes narrowed into slits. The greasy smile was gone, replaced by pure venom. You'll regret this, Cain. This isn't over. I'll bring the law back with me. The kind of law that sells women and children? Elijah asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Bring it. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then the sound of boots retreating through the mud. Elijah didn't lower the rifle until the sound of Mallory's horse had completely faded down the trail. Only then did he close the door and turn around. Rosalie had sunk into a chair at the table, her face ashen. Her whole body was shaking, a tremor that started deep inside and wouldn't stop. Later, after Silas was asleep, Elijah knelt by her chair. He didn't touch her. He just said, his voice low and fierce, You're not going anywhere. Not unless you choose to walk out that door, free and clear. She finally met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd brought her here, she wasn't just looking at him, she was seeing him, and she let herself, for one fragile, terrifying moment, believe him. He had come to reclaim what he thought was his. He had brought the law of men with him. But in this small cabin, high on this lonely mountain, another law was being written. But was the law of love, written in quiet acts and fierce protection, strong enough to stand against a piece of paper? Or had Oren Mallory just declared a war that none of them could win? The storm rolled in the next morning, thick and white as milk. The wind clawed at the shutters, and the old pines groaned under the weight of the new snow. But inside Elijah's cabin, the hearth burned strong and bright. And for the first time in a long, long time, Rosalie didn't feel afraid of winter. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storms she had weathered inside her own heart. She kneaded dough slowly, carefully, letting her palms remember a rhythm they hadn't known since her first daughter was a little girl. The simple, honest work grounded her. Silas sat at the table nearby, reading aloud from one of the old, worn books Elijah had saved from the mission school. His voice, once timid and small, was strong now, steady, confident. Elijah had gone to town alone. He'd left before dawn, the snow already coming down hard. He just said he had something to settle. He hadn't said what. Rosalie didn't ask. Trust, she was learning, was a quiet thing. It didn't need a lot of questions. Instead, she stirred the stew. She tended the fire. She taught Silas how to patch a tear in his own shirt. The house had grown full of their little habits, their quiet routines, warm habits. But even the deepest warmth holds a sense of waiting. By dusk, she was standing at the window, her hands twisting a dish towel over and over. Her eyes were fixed on the darkening trail, which was now almost completely invisible under a thick blanket of white. The world outside looked like a painting. White hills, black tree trunks, the sky bruising to a deep, wounded purple. Then a flicker of movement, a shadow in the swirling snow. A horse. A man. She threw the door open before he even reached the steps, the cold wind snatching the breath from her lungs. Elijah dismounted slower than usual. He looked exhausted, beaten down by the wind and the cold. One hand held a small bundled-up parcel. His other hand was wrapped tight in a bloody bandage. He looked up at her, his breath coming out in smoky plumes in the frigid air. "I went to see the sheriff," he said simply, his voice hoarse. "Mallory showed up before I even got there, spun a whole story, told them you were stolen property." Rosalie's chest went tight, a band of ice squeezing her heart. This was it. The end. "They asked me," Elijah went on, his eyes holding hers. "They asked me if you were mine." He paused, and the world seemed to stop. "I told them no." She blinked, confused. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering candle flame inside her was suddenly snuffed out. "Because you ain't," he added, and his voice cracked on the words. "Not mine like that. You're yours, Rosalie. You've always been yours." Her eyes filled with tears, hot against her cold cheeks. "And the law," she whispered. "I gave them a different paper," he said. He reached into the bundle, his movements clumsy with cold, and pulled out a crumpled, snow-dampened document. "This says you're a free woman. No man owns you, not Mallory, not me, not any more." She took the paper, her fingers trembling, but she didn't look at the words. She looked at his face, at the exhaustion etched into every line. She looked at his bandaged, bloody hand. "You rode through a blizzard for this." "I'd ride through hell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But only if you wanted to stay. The choice has to be yours." She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. Instead, she stepped forward into the swirling snow, out of the warmth of the cabin, and placed her hand, slow, sure, and steady, on the side of his cold, wind-chafed face. His beard was stiff with ice. His eyes were not. That night, as the snow curled around the roof of the little cabin like a protective arm, and Silas slept soundly beneath a thick quilt, Rosalie and Elijah sat by the fire in a comfortable silence. No promises were made, no grand declarations were spoken. There were only two hands, weathered and worn by life, resting side by side on the arm of a wooden chair. He had given her freedom when every other man had only offered chains. He had given her a choice when the world had told her she had none. But as she sat there, watching the flames dance, she wondered if she could ever give her heart to the man who had never once asked for it. And what had happened in town? What had happened to Oren Mallory? The blood on his hand told a story he wasn't sharing, and a part of her was afraid to ask. Spring came slow to the high country, as if it was hesitant. First, there was just a softening of the ground where the sun lingered longest. Then came the sound of meltwater, a secret whispering under the crust of the remaining ice. By April, a brave, defiant green dared to show itself along the banks of the creek. Rosalie had been at the cabin for almost 4 months now, not as a maid, not as a possession, not as something bought and paid for, simply as herself. Every morning she rose before the men. She brewed coffee, its rich aroma filling the small space. She warmed biscuits from the night before, and she just listened to the house breathe before the day truly began. Silas would stumble in from his small cot, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his hair standing up in every which way. And then Elijah would follow, his arms full of wood for the stove, a quiet nod his only greeting. Those simple, predictable moments felt like roots, slowly, carefully, deepening into the earth. One afternoon, Elijah came back from the pasture, carrying something small and clumsy in his big hand. 3 wildflower stems, purple, yellow, and white, awkwardly wrapped with a piece of twine. "They're early," he said gruffly, handing them to her. He wouldn't meet her eye. She took them, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Like you," she teased gently. Then her smile faded a little. "I'm no spring bloom, Elijah." His gaze didn't flinch. He looked right at her, his eyes serious and steady. "You're the first thing that's made this place feel alive in 7 years." From the table where he was practicing his letters on a piece of slate, Silas piped up, a wide, hopeful grin on his face. "Pa, does that mean she's staying for good?" The word hung in the air between them. Pa. He hadn't called him that before. Elijah's eyes softened, but he didn't answer right away. He looked at Rosalie, his expression open, waiting. He let her decide. He had given her the choice, and he would not take it back now. She looked around the cabin, at the worn table, polished smooth by years of use, at the stone hearth, the heart of their home, at the boy's eager, upturned face. She thought of all the winters she had survived alone, cold and hungry and afraid, and she knew with a quiet, unshakable certainty that she didn't ever want to face another one. Her voice came out steady and clear. "If you'll have me." "Yes," Elijah said, just that one word, but it held a lifetime of meaning. And then he smiled. Not the quick, polite kind he sometimes gave in town, but a slow, deep kind of smile, the kind that settled deep into the lines around his eyes. He reached for her hand across the table, and she met him halfway, her fingers lacing with his. "Then it's settled," he said. Outside, the last patch of snow slid from the roof with a soft whoosh. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the scent of stew and fresh bread and the wildflowers in a jar on the table. And though no one else spoke of it, all three of them knew in that quiet moment that they were a family now. No auction, no piece of paper, no man's cruel bargain could make that happen. Only choice. And they had all chosen. After a lifetime of being owned, of being told her worth, she finally belonged, simply by her own choosing. But as she looked at Elijah's still-scarred knuckles, she knew that spring wasn't just a season of new life. It was a season when things buried under the snow were finally revealed. And she had a feeling their peace had been bought at a price that was not yet fully paid. What new seasons would test the love they had so carefully, so quietly found? Some stories don't end with a full stop, but with the door opening just slightly, letting in the bright, uncertain light of tomorrow. Elijah didn't just buy Rosalie and her son to save them from a cruel auction. He chose them, completely and utterly, not out of pity, but because he saw in them a strength and a value the rest of the world had forgotten. Rosalie, once labeled as too old, too tired, unwanted, found a home where she had nothing to prove except the truth of who she was. The boy, who once held his mother's hand in fear, now had a larger, stronger hand always ready to hold his. Life in the West is full of sandstorms and snowstorms and, sometimes, the harshest words you'll ever hear. But this story reminds us that if just one person stops, looks, and reaches out a hand, an entire destiny can be changed. There may be someone in your life right now who feels forgotten, who needs that hand. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Saga channel so you don't miss the next stories about kindness, courage, and late-found love. Share it so more people can hear it. And leave a comment below to let me know. Do you want to see a sequel about what happened next for Elijah, Rosalie, and that brave boy? Or do you want me to tell more deep Western stories just like this one? Because sometimes a word you say today can be the ray of light that leads someone else out of the darkness.